do quantitative and qualitative analysis. We look at Google reviews. We pay really close attention to what our consumer wants. And as a result, we're fairly nimble at creating the most relevant proposition. And I think that's how you make a success of retail investment, being nimble, making sure the proposition is right and executing that plan. But I also think we're now looking at risk-adjusted income returns. So retail as an investment class is starting to look pretty attractive again, especially when you consider it in the context of the other sectors. But what we can do is create the right atmosphere, the right place for dwell time, for footfall, for engagement. And with that comes a retailer that's aligned, hopefully one with whom you can have open conversations and a good relationship and work together to make sure that you're delivering something that's mutually beneficial.
Today on the People Property Place podcast, I'm delighted to be joined by Louisa Butters, Senior Director and Head of Retail Asset Management at CBRE Investment Management. CBRE IM is a leading real assets firm who have some $140 billion under management, over 1,000 team members and offices in over 30 locations worldwide. Louisa started her career at King Sturge, now JLL, and has worked at CBRE Global Investors, Cherwell District Council and Cadogan before joining CBRE Investment Management as a director. And it gives me great pleasure that she joins me on the podcast today. So Louisa, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Not at all. Well, look, I'm really excited to understand a little bit about your background and state of the market where we are today. But before we get onto that good stuff, can we rewind the clock? And can you tell me a little bit about chapter one and how and why you got into real estate?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, the short answer is accidentally, really. It wasn't really my career plan. It wasn't really an industry that I knew much about until I fell into it. So my original plan had been to study dentistry, and I'd gone through all the torture of chemistry and biology A-levels, only to fail at the final hurdle on A-level results day.
Oh, so
no. A rethink was required, which I did on a beach in Australia. So it was good. I realised I actually had never really wanted to do dentistry in the first place. And in fact, that was somebody else's ambition rather than my own.
Is that family's ambition?
Yeah, I think my parents really liked the idea of having a doctor and a dentist in the family. So my older sister's a medic, and I think they just thought that would help them in later life.
Were they doctors or
No,
dentists?
neither.
Really?
Neither. I think they just both liked the idea of a service-led career. Neither of them are into business either. But I think it's partly because of that I ended up looking at the commercial side of things. Sort of while it was new and exciting, I hadn't really seen the pitfalls that other people might have seen had their parents been involved in big corporates or owning their own business. So, yeah, some moments of reflection whilst on a gap year in Australia, and applied to do accounting and finance with French at Birmingham, which I loved. I loved Birmingham. It was going through a real period of change at the time, and I really loved the French aspect of my undergrad. But the accounting and I just weren't a great fit.
You weren't friends. You're a glutton for punishment. Chemistry, physics, accounting and languages.
Somebody should have had a word with me, I think. But I really enjoyed my time there, and particularly my year in Bordeaux. So a year abroad at the University of Bordeaux doing maîtrise in comptabilité, accountancy basically. But whilst I was working there, the English pub that I embarrassingly worked at participated in a big outdoor wine festival called the Epicurial. And it was an amazing sort of fiesta. It happened every 4 years. And all the big winemakers and things were there. It was a fantastic sort of 4 or 5 day event. But whilst I was there at the English pub, the Frog and Rosbif, a group of surveyors came up. They were obviously there on a bit of a jolly, and got talking to them. And it was just really interesting. It was a good balance of sort of commercial output, commercial aspects, as well as it being a people business. And it was that really appealed. Like the combination of both of those things was something I wasn't going to get if I'd gone down the accounting route or diverted to something else. So I was, pleased to have found something that actually sounded like it was a good fit with my personality. So a bit more digging, a bit more research, tapping into any connection I could possibly find. A work experience placement with CBRE in Birmingham at the time, and then went through the grad application hoops and finally landed at Chesterton in 2003, I think.
So what were you like as a kid growing up then? Were you,
probably a nightmare.
But particularly academic or sporty or
no, a bit of
disruptive?
No, definitely not disruptive. I think my parents will vouch for that. But I was at an academic all-girls school, which I found difficult at times, particularly on the academic side. So I always felt like I was bumping along the bottom. And it wasn't until I think I did my GCSEs and I sort of outperformed where anybody thought I would get to that I suddenly had a bit of a boost of confidence. And I think it was that made me go, oh, I could do dentistry. I've got the grades. I can do whatever I want. And what I missed was really the consideration of, is this actually what I want?
Yeah, is it for me?
Is it the right career path? Or am I just choosing it because it's the best career that I maybe thought I would never be able to access? And the proof of the pudding really was in picking some A-levels that I really wasn't well suited to and I didn't enjoy. And I think if I could go back and do it again, I'd do something different, a completely different set. I'd keep the French, but I'd maybe drop the sciences.
Outside of the real estate surveyors that you met at that English pub in France, did you have any friends or contacts within the real estate world? Or was that your kind of first introduction to property and being a viable career?
Yeah, so I had an uncle by marriage who was in property, but with Severn Trent Water, so slightly, not necessarily on the big corporate side, and a cousin who was reading a real estate undergrad. So I did tap into him, and he told me all about the fun side of it, which again really appealed with the people side of it, should we call it, rather than just socialising. So that was good to get a real insight, but it's difficult to access any information about it unless you take the time to do a work experience placement of some form or an internship.
It's still quite a closed industry. It's much better than it was, but I can imagine back in the early 2000s, it was really, really challenging to get a... Yeah,
I was really lucky, because I was applying in Birmingham and I wrote directly to, I think, the head of the office and the head of investment. I knew I wanted to do a bit of time in investment. And I actually ended up doing that work experience placement over the Christmas holidays. So, I had a great time. I didn't see that much of the real estate market at play. I produced a few spreadsheets and I spent a lot of time in the pub.
I can imagine.
So I wouldn't say that was, the only driver to a career in property, but at the time that was a big perk. I could see my mates working big corporate jobs in tall towers and locked inside for days on end in front of a screen, and I knew I didn't want that.
And so it was the blend of actually getting into a career with a ladder and a trajectory combined with an ability to stimulate you intellectually, but also have a bit of fun and work with people you found interesting too.
Yeah, something you've got an aptitude for I think is really important. It's a good motivator, but it's got to be balanced with an element of fun.
So you finished your CBRE internship and you're like, this is kind of route that I want to go down.
Yeah.
How did the role at Chesterton's come around?
So I did the usual grad scheme applications. I think I interviewed with 3. It was difficult being a non-cognate, so with a non-property undergrad. I was competing against people who'd got masters or the right undergrad. And the Chesterton interview, there were 4 topics you could choose to present on. 3 of them were real estate led, and the 4th topic was draft bitter is better than lager. And I knew very little about that as a subject, but slightly more about that than I did about the real estate points. So that was the route I went down, and actually just made it quite funny. And I think that really appealed to the panel of interviewers who'd probably seen a lot of presentations about Crossrail or valuation being an art, not a science. And then somebody that sort of turns up and says, I tested my hypothesis on a night out. It's probably quite refreshing.
Yeah.
So I think I was lucky to land there as a non-cognate, because it was at the time difficult to land those grad scheme positions.
So you landed your grad scheme. Was it just kind of standard rotations, and did you do a master's on the side at the same time?
Yeah, so again, not particularly straightforward route. So Chesterton was in some financial difficulty at the time, and the master's I was meant to be doing was pivoted to an MVQ, which would have been fine had that been what I was sold.
What's an MVQ?
So there was an alternative route to gaining RICS status, which meant I think you gained a tech RICS qualification, and you'd do that rather than getting your master's. Your property master's, you would get a property MVQ. In hindsight, I don't think it would have mattered particularly, but at the time I felt I'd been sold a pup, and I was, right, this is not what I was here for.
Yeah.
So whilst I had an amazing time at Chesterton, I was there for 9 months, and I had a great team that I worked with who were just so welcoming and, good fun. Actually, I wanted to get my master's. I wanted to do the route properly, having pivoted a couple of times at this point. It was important to me to get it right. And I saw a job advertised with King Sturge in Paris, and they would put me on the proper grad scheme with rotations. My master's by distance learning would be fully funded, and that rang the bell for me on so many levels that I jumped at the opportunity, really.
No-brainer.
No-brainer.
And so what role did you go and do at King Sturge in Paris?
I went to help with international investment. So it was a pretty small office, and they wanted English speakers who could help with the underwrite for investment thesis and so on. I tried when I was there to do a bit of work with the business space team, but the French market works quite differently to the UK. And although at that point I did have sort of 9-12 months experience from Chesterton, I was still very fresh to it all. And it was difficult to break into those conversations as French being my second language, and probably at that point not particularly fluent. Having conversations that were, negotiation points on heads of terms was maybe a bit too much of a stretch. So I kept trying, but ultimately I landed continuing with the investment team and a bit of VELS on the side.
So how long were you in Paris for? And did you come back to the UK? And tell me about that kind of move.
So I was in Paris for just over a year, and I have to say that was slightly disappointing. I'd wanted to be there for a lot longer. I'd anticipated, making a life there. But happily, I suppose, I'd met my husband whilst I was at Chesterton, and it was time to come back. So I moved back after about a year. King Sturge were great at accommodating me. And after a short stint in business rates, I moved back into the investment team there, and was there, I think, for another 12 or so months.
And did you qualify at this stage?
No, actually, I realise I sound quite awful here. I was fickle. I wasn't fickle, but I maybe sound that way. I actually qualified at CBRE GI, so CBRE Global Investors, now CBRE Investment Management. So I switched horses after about a year in investment in the UK and moved to CBRE GI as was.
Having not got your letters?
Having not got my letters, but getting them about 6 months after.
That's quite a big risk.
So
at the time, not that many people would do that. They'd kind of wait, get their letters, get the salary rise, kind of bank that, maybe land in the team that they wanted to do, and then look to move. You decided to kind of change.
Patience is not a virtue of mine, which can be a blessing and a curse. And yeah, you're probably right. I maybe could have stayed and banked that pay rise and skipped later on, but I really liked what CBRE GI were doing. They were hugely acquisitive at the time. The pace of their investment deals was fast. It was nimble. They were the talk of the market. It was a really exciting place to be. So I'm glad I did it. I just feel a bit guilty for King Sturge. I'm sorry that I took your master's money and did a run.
Took your experience in Paris. Thank you for taking me back to the UK. And used it. But, I think at the early stage of your career, it's important to go and try different cultures, different parts of the market, build your understanding, and be selfish as well. And to a point, of course, without burning bridges. But what was it about the principal side that you wanted to go and be a part of rather than being on the advisory side?
I think the ability to be making the decisions rather than to be on the receiving end of them. So I wanted to be in control. I mean, bearing in mind I was, very junior. I made very few decisions independently whilst I was there, but it was being on the team that was making them and influencing your client, your separate account mandates into, what we should be buying when there was, huge amount of discretion within those funds at the time. And that made things exciting. You could affect change yourself.
And did you go as an analyst, or what role did you kind of go and join as?
So I think I joined as senior surveyor, but then the positions were renamed to analyst and senior analyst and things. I think it was more to fit with an American model. I did work as an analyst, but I would say that was on the periphery of what I did. A lot of what I was involved in then was buying and selling for I think 3 or 4 different portfolio mandates, but also the deal execution, getting those occupancy rates as high as possible, making sure that rent was collected on time, and pursuing arrears that were outstanding, all the real nuts and bolts, which I'll be honest, it's not that dissimilar to where I am today. It's just the scale's a bit different.
And was that, in terms of the investable universe, offices, retail, industrial, or what were you predominantly working on at that stage?
Yeah, we were cross-sector. So we weren't in specialised teams at that point, which was good. It was quite enjoyable, and I think there's still relevance in that today when you're dealing with smaller lot sizes that maybe don't require specialist expertise. With the assets I'm dealing with now, they are much bigger. They are more cumbersome. You need a longer term strategy if you're going to deliver to your clients' aspirations. So that sector specialism is crucial now, dealing with the types of assets that I'm working with.
But at that stage, Aiden stage, you could work across a variety and really build your investment and asset management muscle,
and
brain.
I think really important to get that kind of exposure. You don't want to specialise in your 20s. That's way too early. You want to know enough to know which sector you want to back, which sector you find interesting.
And were you working across kind of core plus through to value add or development led opportunities, or was it not segregated like that?
Less on the development side, a bit of value add. Core plus predominantly, I would say.
And did you enjoy the kind of investment acquisition and disposition work, or was it more of the asset management and business plan implementation and execution piece that you enjoyed?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a sign of the times. I don't remember doing much in the way of disposals. There was a lot more acquisitions. So that's really dynamic and interesting. And, on the road looking at various opportunities and drilling into the underwrite and, which one are you going to pick? You you've got a sector weighting that you need to abide by. So you can if you've only got room for one bit of high street retail, then you need to make sure you pick the right one.
Can you talk to me about, you're doing a lot of transaction work and some asset management work. Can you just talk to me about maybe the impact or your recollections of the global financial crisis and how you dealt with that? Yeah.
So probably quite luckily, I was on mat leave when it really came home to roost. But it was a pretty awful time as a corporate. I know there were big fallouts. We had to make difficult decisions. And I was distracted, but very worried about what position that might leave me in when I came back to work. Happily, though, I was able to step back into my role, albeit on a different fund, but a slightly different business too. Lots had changed. So when I talked previously about, lots of time socialising with colleagues and things, actually that very much wound down. It was probably a good thing. The we all did need to knuckle down.
It became a bit more institutional, a bit more grown up.
Both of those, grown up and a bit more institutional. And I think the industry was ready for it. I mean, there are still diehards out there now who are living that sort of career, and I admire them enormously. But I think I prefer having a bit of a better balance these days.
And was that a challenge coming back, with changing your personal life, but also coming back in terms of almost a new business, new approach, and trying to find your feet and navigate that route back? Really
difficult. I mean, as I say, I was lucky that I missed out really on the coalface because I wasn't there. I was on mat leave. But upon return, it was clear that quite a lot of seismic changes had happened within the industry, albeit through the prism of COVID, they look like relatively minor. But yeah, things started to pick up quite quickly on the recovery side. So again, it was great being part of a dynamic business that was winning mandates and things still. That said, coming back with a baby, and by this point we'd moved out of London, a commute to contend with, it was a really difficult juggling act. So I won't say I found it easy.
I guess people still find it challenging today, but the industry's come an awful long way from there. It's still got a long way to go, but it definitely isn't surprising, and people won't be surprised to hear that it was is a difficult challenge. How did your role evolve, or what was your kind of thinking with that transition, moving out of town?
Well, at the time it was more driven by personal circumstances, with a young baby and actually wanting to be outside of central London rather than in the thick of it. But, I came back to work for a year after mat leave, and then my husband and I made the decision together that actually some time for me to be at home was probably no bad thing. He's also in real estate, so only one of us really could be on that Marylebone train every day. So I fell on my sword and stayed at home, which I loved. It was good times. It was nice to have some time out of the profession. But I will just say I wasn't twiddling my thumbs and at playgroups and stuff. I did set up a sort of cottage industry during my time at home. So I set up a catering business, which I really enjoyed. It scratched another itch for me. It was back to that commercial nature, always pretty motivated about getting stuff done. And that turned out to be more successful. So I probably stayed at home for longer than I'd anticipated. I kind of thought it would be a 2-3 year tops, but actually it turned into 5-6 year career break.
But it enabled you to pursue alternative endeavours, right? And build different skills or experiences and explore different passions. Because as you touched on, you're definitely not one to rest on your laurels or kind of wait around.
It was good in lots of respects. I've got huge admiration for anybody that sets up their own business and grows it. I mean, it's a minefield. It's a real labour of love. There's a huge amount of investment, not just financial, that goes into setting up a business, let alone taking it further than that. I don't think it would be for me longer term. It isn't for me longer term. It's I quite like being part of a bigger business. I quite like being part of a corporate. Security, I think, is important. So whilst I'm quite up for a bit of a risk, it's always measured. And setting up your own business, it was enjoyable whilst it lasted, but growing it was probably one step too far for me.
You came back into real estate, if I'm not mistaken, in July 2016?
So the reason I went to Cherwell was, the opportunity was great. I was meant to be setting up that property and investment fund. It was local to me. I could drop my kids off at school and I could get to the office. It was tough in lots of ways. I did, my first choice would have been to come back into London again, but on 3 days a week. And at the time that just was difficult to come by. Certainly as
almost impossible
from a position of, unemployment within the field.
Yeah.
I think they were, it may have been easier. Were you employed and wanted to reduce your hours, but going in straight up and saying 3 days a week is what I can do was just not appealing at the time.
It doesn't surprise me. I remember, a couple of people would talk about it being an option, but actually would they deliver on it if they were looking for someone? Very, very rarely.
Yeah. So hence working locally with flexi time really worked for me. Yeah.
And if I'm not mistaken, this was 2016. This is a time when kind of councils are thinking, how can we make more money from real estate, because all the private investors and developers are making a fortune. How can we get in on the act, right? And top up the deficit or make some moves on our patch. But realistically, they're not really set up as property investors, developers.
No.
So what were some of the challenges that you had to overcome? How long have you got?
There were quite a few. As you say, local authorities are quite naive at the time, thinking it's quite easy to make cash from this. But it was only a few days in when I asked to see the rent roll for the operational property that they owned, and that's when I realised that actually things weren't being done in the way that I was used to them being done. Rent wasn't collected on time, arrears weren't pursued, asset management just was practically non-existent. And fair enough, real estate ownership isn't the local authority's strength. They never pretended to be, but it was difficult to invest on Cherwell's behalf without first sorting out the fundamentals. So I found myself going down rabbit holes, really, of trying to overhaul systems that met with huge resistance. I had a great commercial director at Cherwell who was a big supporter and was really keen to see things reformed, but small voice in quite a big arena. And I felt like I was hitting my head against a brick wall. So sadly, because the convenience was amazing, and I liked the idea of doing something good for my local community, my local area. But reluctantly, I accepted that I needed to come back into London somewhere a bit more dynamic, and hence accepted the role at Cadogan.
Quick one from me. If you haven't already subscribed or followed this show on the podcast or app where you listen or watch, please do. It takes 10 seconds and helps tremendously. I've got really big plans for the People, Property, Place podcast, and that one small action really, really helps grow the show and the presence and enables us to keep doing what we're doing. So if you haven't already, please follow or like on the platform you watch or listen to. Thanks so much. For those listening who don't know Cadogan, can you just give me a bit of an overview of Cadogan and what was the kind of role and remit that you kind of joined and carried out?
You're asking now. I'm not sure I certainly can't get the stats right. But so Cadogan landed London estate owned by Lord Cadogan and has been in that family for generation upon generation. So a slice of some of the most amazing real estate in central London.
But a different type of organisation to the advisory world that you started in, and then the kind of fund management world, and then the entrepreneurial kind of mum family juggling legend through to council to come into like a landed estate. That must have been a completely different mindset and approach, but quite a good toy set to play with as well.
Yeah, I mean, amazing assets. When we lived in London, we lived in Pimlico, so I spent a lot of my mat leave pounding the pavements of Chelsea. And I just loved it. I loved the retail, the F&B, their longer term ambitions were inspiring. They had good ideas and they were executing them. So whilst, London estate, you tend to think of it being quite slow to reform, actually there were some pretty big changes taking place at Cadogan, which, were really appealing to be a part of.
And it being real estate, being a real estate company and real estate being front and centre meant that you had the remit and the ability to go out and execute on some of these.
Well, and
these
the longer
plans.
term view, that was really helpful to making decisions at CBRE. GI, I'd been used to making decisions that were purely investment focused, i.e. what's going to deliver the best return to our clients. Cadogan is about delivering the best return to the people, the community, the stakeholders, much bigger picture. And consequently, the bottom line and the return on investments was less important. Important, but not the most important.
Other considerations to be mindful of. And was it a mixed portfolio that you were responsible for, or did you start to try and focus on retail in terms of a bias?
Yeah, it's definitely mixed. So we were allocated at the time, I'm not sure how it is now, but at the time we were allocated a patch, and mine was Sloane Street, which was pretty amazing. Bit of real estate to be looking after. But within that, there are offices, leisure, car parks, residential, a real smorgasbord of bits and pieces of real estate. So whilst it was predominantly retail and the big shiny flagship retail stores, actually there was quite a lot to get your teeth into when it came to looking at pockets of other sector.
How were you combating the rise in e-commerce through 2017, 18, 19 from a real estate and portfolio curation perspective at Cadogan? So
we were pretty lucky certainly with Sloane Street, that online penetration was pretty minimal when it came to luxury retail. COVID changed things around, but this is prior to that. So we had a lot of overseas visitors who accounted for a huge proportion of spend on the street. So to that extent, we were covered. But also at the time, we had the VAT relief that is no longer there. That's disappeared with Brexit. So I'd say that's probably a threat. And I'm sure all the landed estates, all resellers really in London have a plan to deal with that. Online penetration wasn't really a concern. What was a concern was people coming to browse in the Sloane Street shops and then going and buying at another location. So the consumer would benefit from the expertise in store, but would actually go somewhere else and buy it where maybe they had a loyalty card or were getting some perk that Cadogan couldn't equal. We did work quite hard at a Sloane Street loyalty card, and I'm not sure where that's landed, but really difficult to get these things up and running.
And I guess that's where being an asset manager and curating portfolios and placemaking is really important, to try and retain customers and placemake.
Yeah, absolutely. And, the plans for Sloane Street, which I think are now being put into action, so lots of greening, lots of planting, making the street a more attractive place to be. They're all part of a bigger picture. And actually, King's Road, I think, has been through a pretty big metamorphosis in terms of placemaking. Lots more F&B going in to increase dwell time, and to make sure you're really appealing to that local audience. There's a great captive audience within Chelsea, but also a wider UK domestic audience. Chelsea is a destination, and people will go there if Cadogan do as they have done to date and evolved, been proactive on their strategy and adapted.
You moved to CBRE Investment Management. It was CBRE Global Investors that you worked at previously, and I guess moved back to the business, although it had probably been through many different changes by that stage. Why did you make the move? And can you just tell me about the journey you've been on over the last 5 years or so?
Yeah, so I moved back in 2019, and basically because I had a call with one of my old colleagues who was looking to recruit, and I'd been at Cadogan for 2 years, and I was ready really to take the next step, which wasn't an obvious one at Cadogan. So I made the move back, and as you say, same business, but lots of changes. So they'd merged with ING not long after GFC. So a slightly different business, but actually what I really liked were lots of the same faces there. My contemporaries were now practically running the show. It was pretty impressive.
So it kind of had an air of familiarity, but a new opportunity and kind of clear mandate to do something different.
Yeah, exactly.
And so did you specialise in retail specifically at that time? Or was your role within asset management broader than that?
I was responsible for our UK shopping centres along with a colleague. And I think they were really looking for some retail specialism or pleased to have some retail specialism. You know, at Cadogan, we developed our relationships with our occupiers, and actually that was really useful stepping back into it with CBRE IM.
2019 and retail, that's a tough gig. You know, if I recall at that time, retail was a really dirty word, and trying to get anyone to badge their name to retail is nigh on impossible. You know, you're catching knives, and there's nowhere, you know, there's no light at the end of the tunnel. You know, how much convincing did you need? And are you a glutton for punishment, or was it just?
I like a challenge. I definitely like a challenge.
Well, it was the challenge of it, was it? And
yeah, and you know, with any market disruption comes opportunity.
And is that all about setting a plan, a vision, and either curating or getting ahead of the customers and saying, look, this is what we're anticipating are going to be the key things? Or is it more bottom up than that? And it's actually looking at the trends, engaging your occupiers and curating and creating something that they want?
Well, I think it's a bit of both. I mean, the last thing you want to do is lead the witness, although we sometimes do test strategies on consumers when they're open to it. We use a huge amount of consumer insights to determine what our visitors think of our scheme, how we could improve it. They're incredibly useful. We do quantitative and qualitative analysis. We look at Google reviews. You know, we pay really close attention to what our consumer wants, and as a result, we're fairly nimble at creating the most relevant proposition. And I think that's how you make a success of retail investment, being nimble, making sure the proposition is right and executing that plan. And that's where I'd say at CBRE IM, we're really good at that. We do it.
And is your customer or consumer your occupier, your tenant, or are you looking at their consumer?
That's a good question.
How and which lens and how do you go about segmenting that?
The consumer is our visitor.
So consumer is your visitor.
The end user, yeah. So, you know, the bit that we can curate is how our scheme appeals to the demographic. What we can't curate is how a retailer might pivot their strategy or how their corporate success might ebb and flow. Well, our hands are tied on that legally, even as a lease. There's very little you can do. But what we can do is create the right atmosphere, the right place for dwell time, for footfall, for engagement. And with that comes a retailer that's aligned, hopefully one with whom you can have open conversations and a good relationship and work together to make sure that you're delivering something that's mutually beneficial.
How do you balance income with turnaround and void periods, as well as kind of wanting to have kind of anchor tenants, as well as maybe more up and coming, vibrant brands that maybe aren't that well known? Yeah,
I mean, in the COVID recovery, it was easier because we had a few voids, so we were prepared to take bigger risks. Now that the occupancy has improved, it's more of a challenge to get those in. But we do try to keep, you know, in most retail shopping centre assets anyway, you'll have a running void. It's the way to generate rental growth. So you're going to have a bit of space to play with in most schemes, and that's where we do allow pop-ups. We let people come in and trial different things. We do community engagement events and things like that. But it is difficult as an independent to get a foot in the door. I'm not going to deny that.
So retail is quite a broad term for a lot of different subsects. There's, you know, shopping centres, there's out-of-town retail, there's prime, there's high street, there's secondary, tertiary. What type of retail do you have at CBRE IM?
So within my mandate, we've got about 1.5 billion of AUM split between shopping centres, retail warehouses, a few trophy assets. As a house, however, the picture's a bit broader. We own a significant amount of retail warehousing. We still have some high street units. It's the full spectrum, really.
And is that everything, shops and uppers, 5-10 million quid up to assets that are worth hundreds of millions of pounds?
Yeah, I can't give you the exact stats, but I would imagine the smallest retail size we own is probably a legacy one at sort of 5 million that, may have been bought as part of a much smaller portfolio and now is looking pretty small fry in a bigger picture. And then the biggest lot size, you're asking now, within the UK, it's probably 150 mil.
And are you seeing a lot of mixed use or alternate uses coming into retail and looking to kind of carve up to the point earlier you touched on Cadogan around placemaking and trying to keep customers there and stickability and spending and data? Are you having to think a little bit more laterally in terms of how you view retail?
Yeah, absolutely. But that's long been the game for retail. As you say, even pre-COVID, retail was in oversupply. So we've been thinking about these strategies for a long time. It's now that they're really, really settling in and taking shape. So, our scheme in Fulham, we introduced co-working to try and get people up to the first floor. And that's got synergy with a pretty significant gym refurbishment that we did there. We've got a leisure play that's going on at the moment, work in progress. So, yeah, it's all about diversifying that use for consumer appeal and proposition as well as investor performance.
And as a landlord, not one that is focused on a particular geographic like you were at Cadogan, do you mind as much if consumers or customers come to one of your assets for an experience but then go and buy online? And how do you check the creditworthiness of a tenant as well, who maybe isn't underwriting the lease with store sales but is backing it up with online sales to justify their position?
Well, I'll break that down. So, we're happy for consumers. We'll welcome them to our schemes, whether they want to spend money or not. They're very welcome. And what we do want to promote is loyalty and engagement, and whether that results in a spend on day one or a spend on day 201, it doesn't really matter. They're our consumer and they're important to us. What we would really like is the retailers to share some transparency around that. We'd love to know if somebody visited our scheme, goes on to spend online with them. Unfortunately, we don't have that model here in the UK. We may have some lease agreements where we do have access to turnover, but it's usually a pretty hard-fought negotiation, and retailers generally aren't too willing to share that data. So that's, blue sky. At some point in the future, it'd be great to have that. And then the other part of your question was around creditworthiness, and maybe
real estate coming out of a marketing budget or spend rather than a property budget when you come to put these retailers into your schemes.
Yeah, I mean, there was sort of a big buzz around the marketing spend a few years ago, and I think that still is a big element of it, but it fits into a much wider omnichannel strategy. So all physical retail space is a showroom, is sales, is experience, is online servicing, returns, collections. You think of a huge number of fashion retailers now where if they don't have it in stock, they can readily produce an iPad and order it to be delivered to your home the following day. It's just part and parcel of the retail experience now. So when it comes to creditworthiness of a tenant, we've gone through a pretty big shake-up. And in lots of ways, that's been helpful. The corporate dynamics have been, or the corporate bonnet has been lifted. We know what's happened. We're all pretty aware of the strategies that corporates use to expand, and we're alert to that these days in a way that perhaps we weren't. We do run pretty extensive checks, partly because we have to for money laundering, but also because we need to understand that where we are supporting a tenant, maybe with rent-free, maybe with a stepped rent or a turnover element at early stages of their lease, we need to know what they're doing, what their ambition is, how they're funded, when it's might dry up, where greater sources of equity are coming, who's running the show, who are the key people. All of those things are really important. So, we don't interview our tenants, but we do like to have a good chat and find out what their plans are. It's also really good for them to meet us and understand that we're a landlord with a face. We are approachable. We have a phone number and an email address, and we're approachable. If there's a problem, you speak to us.
And their success is your success. And
yeah, exactly. I mean, it
together.
Sounds lovely when you say it like that. But genuinely, that is the way we think about it. There's skin in the game on both sides.
You touched on earlier, the retail has had its challenges, but is on the up. Can you just talk about some of the opportunities that you see in the market?
Yeah, sure. So, there's opportunity to create value through repositioning, change of use, reconfiguring. Retail that doesn't deliver to current requirements needs to be considered carefully and a new proposition put in place. That's where the value creation lies. But I also think we're now looking at risk-adjusted income returns. So retail as an investment class is starting to look pretty attractive again, especially when you consider it in the context of the other sectors.
So in terms of a weighting, in terms of a portfolio, you're seeing an increased demand or interest in having a retail component of
certainly
of a portfolio
an increased
weighting.
interest. We expect that to translate into demand, but it's September.
And in any particular type of retail that you're seeing that more prevalent, or
lots of activity around retail warehousing at the moment, which is happening across the board. We're definitely not the only mover in that arena. But potentially shopping centres coming back, particularly ones that are relevant, dominant, and where there's opportunity.
Comes back to location. I guess proper
It
fundamentals,
does.
right?
Yeah, exactly.
ESG buzzword that's been around for a number of years now. As a group, and specifically with your retail hat on, where does kind of the ESG kind of agenda fit into your plans as you look to drive value across your assets?
Yeah, so taking the E, environmental first, it isn't always easy to execute, to demonstrate progress. And I'll speak about the shopping centres actually, because this is probably where it's most difficult to really realise client and corporate ambitions around ESG. But we fought long and hard to collaborate with our tenants to get hold of the data that we need to understand the baseline position and understand where improvements can be made. Luckily, we've reached that point. We've now got a good set of data, a good 3 years of track record that enables us to make decisions. But it is difficult to influence a retailer whose energy consumption, for example, is part of their supply chain, their service delivery. We try as hard as we can to make sure that there are controls around, lights being on and off within a scheme, but it's not always easy to exert that influence. We've explored in depth with solar panels, and in fact we do have panels on a number of our schemes, but I'll be totally honest, the business case for a solar panel in the UK is very different to the business case for a solar panel in Southern Europe. So I'm not convinced that we always see the return that we would hope. I think things will become easier in that regard as the industry improves.
And from an S perspective, I know you're really social and impactful in terms of the work you do. Can you just share a little bit more on that?
Yeah, so we do a lot of work in our schemes with our marketing teams and our amazing centre managers who are great at reaching out to the local community. They work very closely with bids, with local schools, charities. At Angel Central in Islington, we work with the theatre to make sure that the theatre group gets exposure in the run-up to Panto season. We work with lots of social groups. We do collections for coats in wintertime at our transport hubs. We work with food banks and so on. It's really important to us and our scheme and our users, our consumers, that the shopping centres are part of a community-led scheme.
I guess it's all part of that ecosystem that you're responsible for driving, nurturing, and is much more multifaceted with e-commerce and activation and pop-ups. I guess the role of an asset manager must have changed an awful lot in the years since you kind of first entered the market. What advice would you give to someone who's kind of maybe earlier on in the journey about how they can forge a career in this space?
Well, I think that's why asset management, particularly retail asset management, is, in my slightly biased opinion, the most interesting. It is dynamic. Lots has changed. Lots will continue to change. And I think that's why I've been in the role I'm in for as long as I have. It's still interesting. It's still exciting. There's still lots more to learn. Advice to somebody coming into the industry would be, don't specialise too quickly. Do try everything out, and don't rush to commit to something. Really do give it a proper try and test things out and see what fits you best. Also, don't be afraid to switch later on in your career. Plenty of people do that, and a lot of the skills, particularly in real estate, are transferable. So bear that in mind, and I think don't let yourself be boxed in.
Do you think you're a better asset manager because of the investment experience you've had and the multi-sector experience you've had as well?
Yes. Is the short answer. Yes, I think it would be difficult to be an asset manager without understanding the investment thesis behind your holding, your clients' aspirations, timeframes, and so on. Slightly different if you're lucky to be a landed estate where your time horizons are significantly longer and you're not just looking at delivering that investment performance.
As we draw to a close, the question I ask everyone on the podcast is, if I gave you £500 million worth of capital, who are the people, what property and which place would you look to deploy that capital?
I've probably dropped hints throughout this, haven't I? But I'm not sure 500 million would take me where I want, actually. I think I might need a bit more than that.
Some clever financing, maybe.
I'll leverage up. But I think I would buy a slice of London estate. I'm sure lots of people have said that on this podcast. But for 3 reasons, I guess. The location, it is strong. It's proven to be resilient. You know, we've been through GFC, COVID, Brexit. These locations are still performing well. Footfall growth is testament to that. Secondly, the heritage aspect, I guess. So these assets have a history. They've got good, strong architectural bones. There's a social history that promotes engagement, and there's embedded value as a result of that. So I really like that. It's the sort of thing that I would want to own. And then lastly, stewardship. I think it's nice to think that you're a piece of that, a part of that jigsaw puzzle of an asset's lifespan. You know, the assets I'm thinking of would have been around for 200 years, and I hope that they're around for long after I'm not. It would be good to think that during my period of investment, I'd future-proofed, I'd added value, preserved these buildings.
You've had a fascinating career, and I think some of the key takeaways for me is how you've been able to know when to pull the plug on something, be decisive, reinvent yourself, turn your hand to new assets or geographies or cultures, and be clearly relentless and passionate about the work you do. So thank you for sharing a little bit about your background story, how you view the market and opportunities as well. And I'm excited to see how you and the team go on to navigate this next period.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of the People, Property, Place podcast. If you found it insightful, feel free to share it with a friend or colleague. Give us a rating, like, or comment. It helps tremendously. It'd be great to hear from you on LinkedIn. I'm super open-minded to recommendations of guests that we should have on the show or areas of the market we should explore further. So do drop me a message. The People, Property, Place podcast is powered by rockbourne. The team recruit leadership and future leadership hires for real estate owners, funds, investors, and developers. So if you're looking to hire top talent for your business, head over to the website www.rockbourne.com, where where you'll be able to find a wealth of information. Or feel free to drop me a message on LinkedIn. Have a great day wherever you are, and I look forward to catching you next time.